Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be how does sin and atonement work according to the Torah. So this particular idea for this video came from something that I've heard used by different missionaries concerning a thing that's talked about and discussed in the New Testament. And it's from a particular area called the Book of Hebrews, which, just historically speaking, it's often attributed by Christians to Paul, but it's not known who the actual author was of the text. So, what I want to focus in on is on one statement made in particular in this text, where it claims that without blood, without like a blood sin offering, there's no forgiveness. Sorry. And, there's a lot of questions within Christianity of how that's to be interpreted. Now, the thing that's important to this claim that's made, and this is one of the key tenets that's made sometimes by missionaries to Jews, is that there's no way to deal with atonement. When there was a temple that stood, there were like blood sacrifices, and those things helped deal with atonement, or were the methodology to deal with atonement. And therefore, once that ended, once the temple was destroyed, and Jews were in a situation where there was no way to do that process in that particular place, then therefore there's no remission of sins, there's no atonement for sins. And that's one of the ideas that is provided in this particular part of the New Testament, where it talks about there's no forgiveness for sins or atonement for sin without blood. The problem is that this is not from the Torah. So I'm going to address that in this video. But first, let's go and continue to understand exactly what is the claim made here. And I looked up a number of sites, missionary sites that talk about this, and talk about this idea that there's like almost an exchange of an innocent life in exchange for the guilty person. And that's where this particular website deals with this question. And I just kind of took snippets of it so you can get the basis of what I'm talking about here. Um, and a lot of different sites try to kind of reference this back to the different parts of the Torah, specifically to like Genesis like 2:17. And then I guess I would say the worst offenders of this are missionaries who particularly target the Jewish community. And this is Chosen People Ministries, which is headed up by Dr. Michael Brown. And one of the things they mention here is they said one of the most common questions Christians ask or their ministry is, what do Jewish people do today to find forgiveness of sin without the existence of the temple and the ability to offer blood sacrifice? Coming from their perspective, I'm quoting, as believers in the Lamb of God, with sacrificial death atoned for their sins. The question is natural. However, most Jewish people do not give a second thought as to whether or not blood sacrifice is necessary today for atonement. As followers of Jesus who believe in the authority of both testaments, we are well familiar with the words of Moses who wrote, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you in the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement." And they try to say this comes from Leviticus 17:11, 16, chapter 16 and 34 also. Now, here's where the problem comes in with this. And if you know my videos, you know that often what I'm going to say is the same thing. The problem comes in is with taking a translation and manipulating certain ideas based on that translation. And one of the first things I would say it has to be mentioned is this idea where it says, however, most Jewish people do not give a second thought as to whether or not blood sacrifice is necessary today for atonement. This is a basic, fallacy or misnomer, depending on what you want to call it. This idea that most Jewish people don't think about a certain thing, Chosen People Ministries is not one to say, but also the idea that they're putting out here that blood sacrifice is necessary, or ever was necessary. What exactly was the scenario? How does the Hebrew Torah define what's happening in the Torah? Especially when it comes to atonement, especially when it comes to any type of what people call in English sacrifice. And then the last part is, whether or not this statement here that they use and say it comes from the Torah, is actually addressing what they're even talking about. And I'll just go up front for this part here. If you look at the full context of Leviticus like 17:1 and read all the way through to like what they're saying past 16 to like chapter 17, what you find is that what they're stating here is incorrect. First of all, they claim here that the words of Moses who wrote, and that Moses wrote this himself. No, the Torah is the words of Hashem that was dictated to Moses. That's the first thing. The second thing is if you look through the whole chapter, you'll find that this is not a statement being made to claim that, that there's sacrifice and that there's blood, for atonement. What it's talking about is it first gives the idea that it's forbidden for Jews to eat blood or consume blood, and then it starts going through why it's forbidden. So one of the reasons is given is that blood is not for eating; it's partially used for atonement. But as we'll see in just a bit, that's not the only methodology of atonement given, and it's not a sacrifice, for example. So before I can really begin, we have to go through some important terminology. And that terminology will help us understand what actually shows up in the Torah. So the first one is this idea of sin. And this is something that in English is problematic to me from perspective of reading the Hebrew text. The reality is in the Torah, there's not one word for what people would define as a sin, for example. And here's why I say that. In a Hebrew text, what you find is that there's one word that's used in different formats called het, or in the het or chata'a, there's different like versions of the word, but a het comes as all Hebrew comes from a three-letter root, which the three-letter root gives you the meaning of the word whenever it's in its different forms. For example, in Hebrew language. So the meaning of the word het et aleph, which is the three-letter root for het or chata'a, the basic meaning of it is missing the mark or an intentional violation, diverting from the path. Okay, that's the basic meaning. So there are some situations where people are translating or speaking about the idea of sin in the Torah when they're using this word. So this word here is about something, it's a violation of missing the mark. So for example, like I said before, the Torah, its root is dealing with something that hits a target, where hit is like missing the target. The next word is awon, which means twisted or crooked, deviate from the proper way. Okay, so the difference would be here, for example, that when you deal with a het, you have someone who's like missing the mark. For example, they're not like, hitting the target they're supposed to hit. They're violating something intentionally, or they're diverting from the path, for example. Where an one is more of like something that, for example, a person has something wrong with them. So imagine that someone grows up with this really twisted background. They've seen people around them doing like certain types of actions, and then they continue to do it because of the fact that that's the way they grew up. And then, for example, let's say they're exposed to the right way of doing things. Well, if they fall or if they have a challenge to trying to do the right thing, it's because of the fact that they have kind of a twisted or crooked background where they've deviated, or someone says, okay, as an example, let's say someone decides, well, I don't want to get married and I don't want to have children. And then the question is, well, why? And then the answer may be, oh, because I had my heart broken a while back, and I haven't been able to get past that. Well, that's an all one in that kind of understanding, for example, where that shouldn't be enough to say you don't have children. Having children, towarding the Torah is a mitzvah. We don't allow a twisted nature to stop us from doing certain things that are good things to do in life. So the next thing is a sham, which basically means destroying oneself, shame or guilt. So this is a different concept. And also the last one is pasha or pesha, and it means transgressing, misuse of relationship or crime. So these terms are used, generally speaking, to deal with the different, concepts of a transgression against the Torah. And it deals not just with the transgression of the Torah, but like why someone is transgressing the Torah. So for example, when we deal with the, people say like the original sin, where there, it's not termed in Torah as original sin. There is no original sin. The basic issue is the first term, chata, is used for Adam when he ate the fruit, him and Eve, that they missed the mark. That, for example, one of the understandings that's given by the different rabbis of different generations when they're analyzing that story is that, one position is that they weren't looking to do something really wrong. They were looking to like elevate themselves, but they went about it the wrong way. That they, for example, kind of said to themselves that this is where doing this will put us, for example. But it wasn't like, done from the sake of like, okay, well, I want to just, like do something against, the creator of all things. I want to evil, but it was nothing like that, that they missed the mark and that there's consequences for missing the mark, for example. And there's other situations in the Torah where it talks about an awon, something where someone has allowed themselves to be twisted, but they can correct it. And all of these things can be corrected. And the Torah explains how. The next area of terminology is, well, the word atonement. What exactly does that mean? And this is going to be necessary when we try to identify how the Torah tells the Jewish people atonement, can be dealt with, if you want to use that term. So, for example, the letters kaf, pe, resh, in Hebrew is written from right to left, read from right to left. Chaper, lechaper, means to cover or protect, to annul, pardon, etc. And it shows up in the Torah in different types of words like kippurim. So some of you may recognize Yom Kippur or Yom Kippurim, kapara, or kofer or kaporet. Okay, so these all deal with different levels of something that's a cover or to protect or annul a pardon, depending on the nature of the word. Okay, so let's deal with the idea of like when people say sacrifice. This is a big problem whenever I hear this in Hebrew, because first of all, there is no word sacrifice that's in the Torah, for example. What words are used to describe the process that existed during the time of the temple, or the Mishkan, the tabernacle, or the following: korban, Often this is the word that is translated into sacrifice. But the meaning of the word korban comes from the three-letter root kufurish bet, which means to draw near, come close, or within. So the ideal of a korban is not something where you're like giving up something. You can make an idea about some of them that were like that, but not all of them are like that. But the idea is that the process of doing a korban is drawing a person closer to the creator of all things, drawing them in, for example. Especially when you look at when the temple stood, you had to go to a certain place. And then you question, okay, well, who's found in the temple grounds? The temple grounds are going to be people who are keeping the Torah. So the Kohanim, the priests, are keeping the Torah. The Levites, for example, the Levim, also the people who like, the Sanhedrin, those who keep Torah. So this process draws you to the place where it's like the central capital of the Torah, for example, in Jerusalem. So that's a part of the process of bringing a korban. If you live in northern Israel, and there's a time where you bring a korban, which let's be aware that in the Torah does never requires a Jew like every time you make a mistake to pick up, pack up, and run to Jerusalem and try to bring a korban. That's not how that works at all. So the next word that is used to describe a particular type of korban is an olah. An olah is one that's completely burned up on the altar. So it's kosher animals, cows, types like that. Um, then the next one is the hatat. Hatat or chototh is a type of korban, for example, where half of it is like burned completely on the mizbeach or the altar, and then half of it is eaten by the kohanim. So this makes up goats, sheeps, things like that. The shlemim is a type of korban where one third of it is completely burned on the altar, one third of it is eaten by the kohanim, and one third is eaten by the person who brings it. So, for example, goats, sheep, types like that. And there's also like types of korbanot where you have like like chickens, not chickens, sorry. You have like what's kind of doves and things like that, types of birds that are brought in as a type of a korban, for example. Now, one of the things that I noticed that missionaries, I've never really seen them talk about, is there's a type of korban called a minho. A minho is actually not even an animal at all. It's like types of grains and breads, for example, that can be brought. And this often is for someone who can't afford to do the other ones. So, for example, a large number of people in ancient society as well as modern society wouldn't really be able to bring an animal every time they make a mistake, for example, and try to like bring a korban. That what would be most common and easier to attain would be one of grain. And the Torah makes this as something that, could be done as a korban, for example. So this is the one that I would say that I think that not enough stress is placed on this by people who kind of deal with missionaries. The fact that this korban exists, that it's a minhal, and that it's a type of korban. So if you want to call it a sacrifice, this is also a sacrifice. So we learn from this that not every korban had to deal with blood. And not every korban, for example, had to do with animals. And, there were different types of korbanot. And then now we'll deal with, okay, well, what exactly does that tell us about, the idea of atonement itself? If this is the process and if this is the understanding that comes from it, because the blood is a side issue. For example, once you bring your korban, there's not every korban that was brought was dealing with like some kind of like, sin, for example, or some type of transgression against the Torah. There are some of them that a person can say, well, I'm happy about this situation. I'm bringing a korban, so. Now let's deal with some other issues here. So let's deal with what does the Torah state about atonement itself, kapara, for example. How exactly is that addressed in the Torah? Is it really true that, a person like does something wrong and the only way to fix that is with a blood atonement, blood sacrifice, as, people try to say in English? Is that really true? Or even is it true that you have to have a korban in every scenario or else, the creator of all things doesn't listen? So to deal with that, let's look at one part of the Torah in Shemot, which is Exodus 30:13 through 16. So in this, what it describes at the very top, and again, Hebrews read from right to left, at the very beginning, it says, "Ze yitanu kol ha'over ala pekudim." So one of the words used here, ha'over, that's also sometimes used to describe a type of transgression of the Torah, ha'over, like in modern Hebrew, for example, and also like in some elements of ancient Hebrew, avirah is how you describe like a transgression against the Torah, just as a general term. So if someone, for example, does an over ala pikudim, the instructions of Hashem, the requirements of Hashem, it talks about the machatzith hashekel, so the half shekel, but shekel hagodesh. Okay, so it goes on and describes some elements of this shekel, but one of the things it mentions that's interesting in the yellow, kind of in the, somewhat middle or past the middle of the page, it says, Latet et turuma Adonai, turumat Adonai. So you will give what's called a turuma, which is one way to describe it was almost like a kind of thing you would have to bring, to almost like donate to, to the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, things like that. And what it mentions, something very interesting in the green, it says, Lechaper al nafshotochem. So it mentions here, lachaper, which is to atone, ala nafshotechem, which on your souls. So the Greek says something very interesting here. Bringing the half shekel is a type of atonement, for your souls, for the Jewish people's souls. So right here, right now, we have a statement in the Torah that clearly tells us that bringing the half shekel is a type of atonement, because it says lechaper, which is the word for atonement. Okay, and then it continues and it says v'lachachta et hakesef hakipurim. So it says the money, what's called kesef means money. So this half shekel, when it's taken, for example, is considered a type of kippurim. So a kippur is one of the other words we said that is used to describe atonement. So it's a type of atonement. Me'eth b'nei Yisrael v'notat othom al abadat ohel moed. So for example, this is taken for the sake of the people of Israel, the children of Israel, and it was given and is part of was given as the part of the work for the Ohel Moed, which is like back that during that time the tabernacle, for example, and also this is affects the temple. And it says, "Wahoyo lifnei Yisrael lazikaron lifnei Adonai." So it says that this will be like a remembrance before the Creator of all things, before Hashem. And it says here in the green, "Lechaper ala nafshotechem." So it says here that bringing this money to, the temple, for example, this type of kippur was a type of chaper. So again, this is not blood sacrifice. This says that there's other elements that allow us to do atonement. And again, let's be aware, the creator of all things doesn't need money, doesn't need blood, doesn't need animals or anything like that. There's nothing in the universe that says the creator is sitting there like bloodthirsty, like I have to have animal blood, please give it to me. Nothing like that exists. What the issue is that this is for the sake of the people of Israel that all this process is done because there's things, as I've mentioned in other videos, that the Torah is designed in a way where the creator is giving a message with everything that's in the Torah so that the Jewish people can learn from it. So if we look at the previous terms that I explained, all of that is a lesson to the Jewish people. And in fact, the fact that if I go to if I bring, money as a way of dealing with, some of the transgressions I've done. And if I've already, like in my heart, started to make that process of turning around, turning away from whatever transgression I've done for whatever reasons I did it, one of the elements of bringing something that, has value to me, is a way to atone, for that situation. So we see one instance right here already where the Torah tells us that it isn't all about blood sacrifice or blood. So next important part, and this is something that personally, I haven't seen a lot of people deal with this part of it. And this is something that is important because there are some missionaries who say, well, there's no situation in the Torah where it says that prayer is a type of atonement or could deal with sin or you can be forgiven by praying. Now, the Torah actually says something different. In the book of Exodus, also Shemoth in Hebrew, which is 32:30, it tells this, situation where the people of Israel at that generation, because of the mixed multitude, had made the Haytayagel, which means like the golden calf, for example. And it says, "Wahi memochorath wayomer Moshe al ha'om." So Moshe Rabbeinu, after coming back down from Mount Sinai and seeing what had been done and dealing with it, he now says, "Okay, now that we've dealt with what caused it and who the people, the players are that need have to be dealt with on that," he says to the people. Atem hatothem hato'o chodolo. So remember how we talked about the different terminologies? The word het or hata'o is mentioned here. So he says that they make a certain type of, they missed the mark. Because again, if you look at the story of what exactly was being done there, for example, it never says that they said that, the golden calf was Hashem or that, that basically they were trying to replace Hashem with the golden calf. They mention Hashem's name and say that this thing is what led you out of Egypt. And essentially, basically saying we're replacing Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, we're replacing him with this thing because we don't know what happened to him. He's been gone for too long. We have no idea where he is. This is what's replacing him. This will be the thing that'll lead us out. And they mention Hashem's name as something separate, as part of, okay, well, there's Hashem, and then there's this thing leading us, which is, they did what's called Avodah Zarah. But it says specifically here, "Ve'ata alei al Adonai, ulai achapara be'ad hatotachem." So he says that he's going to go up, to Hashem, and he says, perhaps I can make an atonement be'ad hatotachem. Basically he's like saying, I'm going to go speak to Hashem and possibly I can make, basically an atonement for, for the transgressions you guys did, the missing the mark that you did, so if if the requirement was that there had to be some kind of blood sacrifice, this would have been the perfect time to say, I've got to bring a blood sacrifice with me because that's the only thing that'll be able to deal with what you guys did. And doing the golden calf is considered a big deal. So he's saying that he can go up and, potentially do a chapara. So achapara means that I will, go up and basically I will try to like atone for you, if you will, using modern English, for example. I'll make a covering for you, or I'll, try to get this annulled, by discussing with Hashem. And it says, "Vayishav Moshe el Adonai v'yomer, ono chata'o ha'om hazeh, chata'o chadolah, v'yasu lahem Elohei zahav." So Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Hashem and says to him, and like, the people, please, the people have done they've missed the mark big time, for example. And they did this thing, they made, a mighty one of like gold, something to be like, their power or strength. Elohei, as I mentioned in other videos, Elohim and Elohei means power or strength. So they gave, they had an idea where this golden calf would now be the thing that leads them, for example. So it's like they're saying we're replacing Moshe Rabbeinu with this thing. So he says like Elohei Zahav, they made it out of gold. And he says, well, ata im tisa hatotham, im ayin min mechaneno, misifrecho asher kotovto. So he says in response to Hashem that, like he's basically asking now, if you will like lift up, or, the hata'ah, they're missing the mark. If you'll lift that up, um, basically meaning like forgive them, give them atonement for it. That's essentially what he's asking for. And he says to Hashem, he gives a condition that im ayin mechaneno. So if you're not going to do that, im ayin, like well, im ayin, and that's like what he's saying. But if you won't, you know, basically saying erase me from the book that you have that you've written, and it's like it's not saying a physical book, it's like a metaphor. It's like saying, okay, if you have this accounting of reality of humanity, if you won't, like basically forgive them or atone, give them atonement for this, just erase me from, just get rid of me, just like take me out of, out of the picture, take me out of reality, if you will. There's different ways you can interpret that, but then it says Hashem responds. It says, "Well, Yomer Adonai el Moshe." Mi asher chotali am hayanu misifri. So he says the person who did the chata, that's the person who gets erased, not someone else. So this also teaches us that there's no way that someone can say, I'm a sacrifice for that other person over there. There's no such thing as human sacrifice. No such thing at all. The Torah makes this clear. Like, no, the person who did the chata has to address this, not you. You're not the person that addresses it for them. So what this also means is that when we deal with, like, for example, the temple when it stood, and there was a Kohen Gadol who would do certain things on Yom Kippur, if the people didn't make shuvah and return to the Torah, if the people didn't, come correct to Hashem, him going in there doesn't mean anything. So that's the thing here, that one person doesn't atone for everybody else. A person has to first deal with what they did wrong. But we see here that this is a prayer that, Moshe Rabbeinu makes to Hashem. So we see that the Torah is teaching us a lesson here, that it is 100% possible to pray to Hashem and receive atonement. Because again, there's no, biological, metaphysical, requirement in the universe that without blood, there is no such thing as atonement. Hashem didn't build reality that way. And the Torah in Hebrew never states such a thing. Okay. So going a little bit further to the book of Vayikro, or Leviticus, as people say in English, it's chapter 16, and it says, وَيَطَعُ لَكَمْ لَهُكَاثْ عُلَمْ بَخُدَشَ الشِّبِعِي بَعَصَرَ لَخُدَشْ تَعَنُوا أَثْ نَفْشُوثَكَمْ بَخُلَ مَلَخُ لَوْ تَعَصُوا هُوَ أَزْرُخ وَهَجِرْ هَجُرَ بَثُوخَكَمْ. So essentially what this says is that, and it will be, basically like a chok, which is like a statute, for eternity, forever, on the seventh month, on the 10th of that month, that basically you will like, fast, ta'anu af nafshatachem is understood to mean fasting. B'chol melacho lo ta'asu b'ho esroch v'hajir hajor batochachem. So essentially what it says is that the no melacha, which is like the type of work that's forbidden to do on Shabbat, is also forbidden to do on this particular day, which is the seventh month, the 10th day. And it says this is for someone who was a native-born Israeli or someone who converted to the Torah, who lives amongst native-born Israelis. And then in the green it says, Ki vayom hazeh yechaper alechem. So this is talking about Yom Kippur. So it says here, specifically in the green, Ki vayom hazeh yechaper alechem. Remember the word yechaper? Essentially translating, it says the day of Yom Kippur itself is an atonement for the Jewish people. The day itself. It doesn't say like what's done on the day. It says, Ki vayom hazeh yechaper alechem. Letaher etchem. This is the continuation. To like, almost like purify you. Mikol hatothachem. To, like from all of your like chata'ah, all of your like missing the marks. Lifnei Hashem titharu. So before Hashem, you will be like cleansed in a sense. So essentially what this tells us is that when the Jewish people do Yom Kippur, there's atonement for that. That the day of Yom Kippur does atone. Now, again, atonement in the Jewish perspective means that a person has already done some work beforehand. Meaning that let's say I badmouth some people. Some people, like, I did some things that were against the Torah. For example, and I realized that before Yom Kippur that I did some bad things. That there's a process that I go through according to like Jewish law. That I would have to go to the person and try to like basically first of all I have to understand what I did wrong and make a commitment within myself that I'm not going to go back to be that. It's almost like like one particular perspective is that I become a different person. So I don't even recognize who that guy was. That guy who said those things, I'm not that guy anymore. I don't even know who that was. And I'm ashamed that that was ever me, but I'm not that guy anymore. So essentially before Yom Kippur, a person deals with that. And on Yom Kippur itself, once they've dealt with that, the day itself is an atonement because there are things that a person sees on Yom Kippur, learns on Yom Kippur, does on Yom Kippur. There are things that, are in like when we Jews have Yom Kippur, there's certain prayers that we say. And there's a lot a person can learn from those things that happen, and it can help them in the process of becoming a different person or better person. So that's the idea that the day itself of Yom Kippur does atone. The day itself. It doesn't say anything about a blood sacrifice specifically here. It says Kiva Yom Hazeh Yechaper Alechem, the day of Yom Kippur itself. So we've seen two things so far. We've seen that bringing the three things actually. The half shekel is an atonement. We see that prayer is an atonement, and we see that that basically the day of Yom Kippur itself is an atonement. So again, staying within Sefer Shemot, the next thing that is mentioned a little bit later on, when the people of Israel had followed the Er Rav, the mixed multitude, in making basically a type of Avodah Zarah, the golden calf. When Moshe Rabbeinu goes to talk to Hashem, one of the things that Moshe Rabbeinu asks Hashem is if that he could like almost like fully understand Hashem. And one of the things he's told, which is in the green, is Lo tuchal lir'ot ayat panai, ki lo yira'ani ha'adam v'chai. So essentially, what Hashem says is that you can't see my face, if you will. And again, this is like the language of men that's being used here. This is kind of when it's being talked about. It's not saying that Hashem has a face, but it's more like you can't fully experience Hashem and understand Hashem. And the context with this is mentioned that you can't understand it and be alive, meaning that it's not like okay you must die now and then, but it's like saying, for example, being physically connected to a body, our eyes, our senses are the things with which we interact with the world. But there are things that our eyes can't see, things that our ears can't hear. There are animals that can hear on a level better than humans. There are animals that can see better than humans. And there are spectrums that happen in the universe that we can't see and fully experience. So within a physical body, you can't fully, experience Hashem. Um, and of course, there's also limitations of where you are personally. If you're personally not like close to Hashem and you're far away from Hashem, well, you definitely can't even see it even in the next world. So what's mentioned in the yellow, and I'll provide the translation now, is Elu rahumachanun erech apayim or rav haser waamet noser haser le'elofim noser awan wafashak wahato'o wanake lo nake poched awan avod al banim wa al bnei vanim al shileshim wa al ribe'im. So essentially, what's mentioned here is another characteristic that's given of how Hashem interacts with us. And essentially, this characteristic is mentioned in terms of the actions of Hashem that we perceive, that He's merciful at the highest degree. Not, this is kind of just a general translation, that He provides, basically mercy to like, the highest degree to, any part of humanity that is willing to, embrace Hashem and also do the mitzvot of Hashem. That the mitzvot are, the way that that Hashem, shows mercy to the world, and that by following them, that person is seeking out that mercy. But a person who does the opposite of it, for example, and their children do the opposite of it, like say their fathers do it, and then the children follow after their fathers and the mothers and such, that continue, the opposite side of that continues with them. So it'd be like saying all the bad things that can happen in life, if you've chosen that path, then you can have it. It's like saying that's free will. The ability for you to have either the good that exists in the world or the bad, depending on what it is you're striving for. And Hashem, being merciful, is willing to, give you whatever you ask for if that's what you really want. So this is a characteristic that we see played out, not just, in that time, but through all of humanity. And the Torah is the methodology we know how to interact with Hashem. So one of the ways we can test this idea is if we look in the Nevi'im, in the book of Yonah, in this is chapter 4. So one of just the backstory, for most people I think know it, but Yonah was told by Hashem to go to a place called Nineveh, where he was told to tell them that, in 40 days, in the Hebrew, it's like basically says like their whole city will be overturned or it'll be reversed in a sense, which there's kind of two understandings of it. Yonah initially decides to run away. He tries to like basically escape from doing this nevuah until finally, a number of events happen that cause him to go ahead and do it. So he walks around the city, I think, for about 40 days, and he's announcing like to everyone, just kind of walking back and forth, that the city will be overturned in 40 days. And he doesn't give anything like unless you do this. It's just like the city will be overturned in 40 days, and that's what he was told by Hashem to say. So we're told that the entire city, from the king all the way down to almost pretty much like the animals, turned back, to the way that they were supposed to be. Meaning, for them would be the Noahide laws. They turned away from all the stuff they were doing that was against the law, the mitzvot of Hashem, the mitzvot that were supposed to keep, and then they like made what's called teshuvah. They made complete turnaround. So essentially, Yonah walks away mad. Basically he prays to Hashem, just kill me, just take my life. And he mentions here something very interesting. And this is, I'll skip most of the stuff that's not highlighted. But he says here at one point, starting kind of one of the highlighted areas, ki yadati ki ata. So he's like, because I knew, and he's explaining why he ran away. And then he starting in the green. He says, Elohanu marachum erech apayim rav chesed. So he's basically saying here that because I knew that you, talking about Hashem, are merciful, and that you would basically it's like saying I knew that you would, if they made tshuva, if they turned around, you would forgive them. Then you would turn away from the thing that you had said would happen. Because it's like saying I knew that was the characteristic that I understood from the Torah, because what he's mentioning here is directly from the Torah in the green. So he adds something to that where he says in the yellow, v'nihom al hara'ah. So it's like saying that there are people who, for example, think that Hashem is always looking for the bad things that people do and waiting to punish them. But he's saying the opposite here. He's saying that I knew that you weren't trying to destroy them. I knew that if they made tshuva, if they turned around and did the right thing, then you would forgive them. Now I remember hearing once that there's I think a commentary on this, that Yonah knew that eventually Nineveh would attack Israel, but in order for them to do that, they had to turn things around and be what's called tzaddikim. So if Israel's not doing the right thing, the only way that the punishment for Israel could be is if someone comes in who's already doing the right thing, if you will, at least for that moment, to be able to do something there. So Yonah says, based on knowing the Torah, he's quoting the Torah here when he's talking about this, that he knew that Hashem was merciful. So he knew this characteristic already. So what we can understand is that this characteristic is a fixed characteristic of Hashem, that is something that Hashem doesn't change from. So whenever we see in a situation where Hashem says, okay, Israel, you're messing up, and here's the punishment, we know that, for example, we were told this is the way things operate, that not doing the mitzvot puts us in a certain position. But we're also told if we turn around and do the right thing, it puts us in the right situation with Hashem. And this is a given at any point in history. So kind of going back to the last two slides, because the last two slides were actually from a previous video I did. The first of those last two slides, for example, actually when dealing with the characteristics of Hashem and how Hashem is overabundantly merciful, the interesting thing that I didn't mention there is that the three of the different words when I mentioned about what the different words are for sin in Hebrew and how there isn't one word, they actually show up in that description where it says that basically the alwan, the hata, the pesha of Am Yisrael, that Hashem would basically almost like clean us from those things, and all it takes is for people to turn around. And in the last slide, one of the things I didn't mention when I previously did the video that came from about the nature of Hashem is that there's an understanding, which I did mention in another video, from the Torah and also from the prophets, that bad, predictions, for example, of the future don't have to happen. Only the good ones. So, for example, let's say that the people of Israel we're messing up. We're doing something wrong. A prophet is sent, a Navi is sent to say something about it. And he says that, okay, like Yonah, like in 40 days, the whole thing's gonna be overturned. Well, that bad thing doesn't have to happen. If people make teshuvah at the right time in the right circumstances, it doesn't have to happen. It isn't fixed that it has to happen. What is fixed is if it says, if you turn around, I'll bless you in this way, or I'll protect you in this way, or you'll succeed in this way. That stuff has to happen. So if we're doing the mitzvot of Hashem, those things have to happen. If something is not going that way correctly, we may have to look and say, are we doing something wrong here? Are we making a mistake that's causing that? Is there something that's falling apart in society that's preventing that from happening? So we see there that anything that's negative doesn't have to happen. Only the positive has to happen, but the negative is a consequence of our actions, for example. Okay, so what I want to do now is go to the rest of the Tanakh, outside of the Torah, and see what it says about this issue. Because again, we've established that the Torah has established that there are other things that allow us to have, like, if you will, a covering, an atonement, things like that. And it isn't all, like the missionaries were saying, that it isn't blood sacrifice, and that's not even the issue there from what they say. Okay, so if we go to Yechezkel, Ezekiel, 18:20. It says there, "Hanefesh hachoteth, he tamuth. Ben lo yisa wa'awan ha'ov, wa'av lo yisa ba'awan haben." So what it says in the green is that the person or the soul that does, hoteth, which is like a type of hata or het, the, transgression that we mentioned that is like missing the mark. That is the person that suffers the consequence. So in the yellow it says, the son doesn't, you know, um, doesn't basically suffer or have doesn't have the consequence of being responsible for the awon, meaning that remember we talked about the twisted nature. That's if you can see my mouse, that's this word here, awon. So that's one of the words we mentioned earlier. This is the hoteth or hata or het that we mentioned before about different words that are used. But then here it mentions ba'awon ha'ov. So for example, a son doesn't suffer, on his own because of the awon or the twisted nature of his father. And it says the father doesn't suffer from the awan of his son. So what this would mean is that, yeah, okay, on some level, you may have some challenges in life because your father did some bad stuff. But in terms of Hashem, you don't carry the burden of, the awan of your father on your back because, he did something. You can choose to do something different. But you only carry that if you continue to take his path and follow like his bad behavior, for example, or his bad nature. And then, continuing with this, it basically says, "Sitkat hatzadik olav tiyeh, u'rishat rosha alav tiyeh." So if a person is, doing the right things and being correct before Hashem and following the mitzvot, which the mitzvot also deal with how you deal with challenges, problems, or mistakes. If a person is following that path, the fact that their correctness, is what they are. Where a person is doing the opposite of that, then that's what they are. Okay, so continuing in Yehezkel, in the same chapter of 18, 20, in chapter 21, it says, "Uharasham ki yeshuv mikol hatothob asher alsam, v'shemar et kol chukothai, v'asa mishpat utztaka haya yichaya lo yamuth." So here it says that the bad person, the rasha in Hebrew, is sometimes evil, sometimes bad, depends on how you want to translate it. It says that, if he will, return, or turn away from his hatat, het, his transgressions, which we said are, based upon missing the mark that he's done. And if he will keep the statutes of Hashem and do mishpat, which is like almost like saying doing the right things in life, being correct, then he'll live. He won't die. And with the living and dying here is more. It's kind of like a metaphorical situation where it's talking about in terms of some cases like the world to come, and also how a person's life is like being directed. So this is basically describing what the Torah describes. This is the prophet. He's not making up something new. He's not bringing something that had never been heard before. These are the things we see from the Torah that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so continuing, when in verse 27 of the same chapter, it says, "Shuv Rasha mirishotho asher asom v'ya'as mishpat utztakahum ethon nafsho yahayeh v'yir'a v'yoshov mikol pasha'av asher also hayo yihayeh lo yamut." So again, it repeats the same kind of like a statement here in Yechezkel, that basically the person who is a Rasha, who does evil, who turns away from that and basically becomes a different person, does something correct with the Torah, then it's considered as if he's correct. That he's a correct person. And in English, people try to say, well, righteous. Well, righteous, has it's not really defined very well in English, but you could say righteous. You could say this person is righteous. And it continues and says, okay, remember I talked about the different words that are used. So we say that, if he turns away from what he's done that's wrong, the word pesha is here. So we've seen kind of a glossing of every single word that I mentioned earlier that the Torah uses to describe some kind of, transgression of the Torah. It tells you that every single form of it can be dealt with, that a person can deal with, and it doesn't say that blood sacrifice is needed. What it says here is the person turns away from it. Now, the person asks, as I mentioned before, okay, well, why is this even in the Torah that you have, like the korbanot? Because the korbanot bring a person closer to Hashem. Why? Where does it take the person when you bring a korban in the Jewish sense? Once the Torah is given, where are you supposed to bring a korban? To the temple. Who's at the temple? People who keep the Torah correctly, especially in generations where that was being done. In this current situation without the temple, we have the alternatives that existed before the Torah was given, which, for example, we saw before was doing, turning away from, a bad behavior, turning towards the creator of all things, praying to Hashem and becoming a different person. So we see in the book of Proverbs, which is called in Hebrew Mishle, which is, and this is chapter 16, verse 6, it says, Bahasad wa'amath yuchupar awon. So it says that, basically like mercy and truth is yechaper, yuchupar awon. So you remember that word chaper, the atonement? It says that mercy and truth, will basically are, an atonement for an awon. Remember we talked about awon, a twisted nature. So if a person, is merciful, and if a person, has, is holding by the truth, this is a repair or an atonement for an awon. And it says, "Uviyirat Adonai sur merah." So if a person fears Hashem or is in awe of Hashem, they'll turn from what's bad. And that's a process, for people. There's some people when you have on a one, where you have a twisted nature or something that, is challenging in your background, it takes time to work on that. And it's a working process. But there are people who've decided, for example, I'm going to stop smoking. I've met people who quit smoking cold turkey on their own willpower without anything else helping them because of the fact that they made a decision, I'm not doing this anymore. There are people who've turned away from all kind of things and said, I'm going to become a different person. I don't want to do this anymore. And even though I've seen people do this or that, or my family did this, I'm doing something different. Okay, so we want to deal now with what is the Torah, the Tanakh state about blood. So again, we look back at what the Christian claim here is, and I mentioned this earlier, so I won't stand too much on it. But the idea here is that they're trying to claim that in the Torah it says that basically atonement is only dealt with blood, but we've already seen that that's not true. Okay, so when we look at the actual text that they're talking about, one of the things I mentioned before is that they skip a lot of things in order to try to get to this point of claiming that basically that blood is like the way you deal with atonement. So if we actually look at the Torah, um, that what it explains is the following: it says ki nefesh habasar badam hi wani natati lochem al hamizbeach lechaper al nafshotechem ki hadam hu banefesh yechaper. Okay, so this explains why Hashem gave, the blood to be used in this way. It doesn't say that it's something that Hashem requires, for example, to have atonement, because it says, okay, lechaper ad nafshochem, but this is the same language it was using earlier for the half shekel. It also used the same language, lechaper, for the prayer that Moshe Rabbeinu did, to teach us that we can pray to Hashem and receive atonement. It also, talks about like the atonement that existed from the day of Yom Kippur itself. And it says that Hashem gave this to the, Natati lachem ala mizbeach, so as a way to like address, these things also. But it never says that, without blood, there's no like atonement. It doesn't say that at all, because again, if we want to believe the New Testament version of what they're claiming, the statement would need to be here, but it's not here. So here's what, going back to what I was saying earlier about when it describes exactly what the situation is, and it says, in green, and this is from basically from Vayikra 10, and it says, "Kol adam v'natati b'honai b'nefesh ha'ochelet et adam v'chiparti otho mekarev amo." So again, this is what I was explaining earlier. The point that's made here is that it has nothing to do with like saying that blood is like for atonement and there's no way to atone without blood. It's dealing with eating blood, and it says, "Kol dam v'natati fanai b'nefesh ha'ochelet et hadam." And this is the preceding verse to the other ones we just read. So basically, it's talking about someone who's cut off because of the fact that they're eating, consuming blood. And it says, going on in verse 11, Ki nefesh basar padam hi, wa ani nothati v'lachem ala mizbech, lechaper ala nafshotachem, ki hadam hi b'nefesh yechaper. So this is what we were reading earlier, for example, that it's explaining why we don't eat blood. So it's not saying, okay, well, blood is atonement, and there's only way to deal with atonement, like the New Testament says in the book of Hebrews, that that there's only like through like blood sacrifices their atonement. No, it's saying that you don't eat blood. Why? Because the blood is not for that purpose. The blood is for something else, for example. And it says lo. It goes on in the green here. It says lo tochal dam. So again, it says lo tochal dom. Don't eat blood. Then again, it says domo b'nafshohu. So it explains why. Then it says dam kol basar lo tochelu. So again, it says, don't eat blood. So then it says, Damuhi kol ocholov yakoreth. So someone who eats blood is cut off from his people. Someone who willingly consumes blood is cut off from his people. This is what the Torah is saying. It's not saying anything about blood being specifically used for like, the atonement, and that's what it's used specifically. Only that brings atonement. It's saying, don't eat blood. Here's why. It has nothing to do with like trying to make this statement that the New Testament makes. And then going on, concerning the Kohanim, One of the things the Torah mentions that the Kohanim eating is a type of atonement for the people of Israel. So I'll go to the highlighted parts. It says, "V'othal nothan lochem loset et arvon ha'ayadol." So he says, talk about like I'll start from the beginning here. It says, "Wa'et sa'ir hatoth." So the basic the chata, the offering that's or the korban, that's a type of chatat, from a seir, which is a type of animal. It says, "Doresh Moshe, wahine sorof." So basically, it's talking about the process for this, and it says, "V'yiktsof ala alazar wa ali tamar b'nei Aaron hanothorim lemor." So it's talking about like the sons of Aaron and the process that they're dealing with in terms of this particular korban. And it says, basically, this is where Moshe Rabbeinu approaches them, and he's angry because he sees that they're not eating this particular korban in the place that he was expecting them to eat it. And he basically says, "Madua lo achalatem et hachatoth b'makom hakodesh ki kodesh kodoshim hui." And it says like, okay, well, he says to them, why aren't you eating it in the Kodesh Kodeshim, in the holy, if you want to English, the Holy of Holies. And he says to them, a very interesting point, which I mentioned earlier in the yellow, "V'othal notan lochem, lo set at all one ho'edom." So basically, by them, he says here, they're supposed to be eating in the Kodesh Kodeshim because them eating it, he says, is to like lift up the awon. Remember that word we used, awon, twisted nature of the community, ho'edom. And it says here, lechaper alehem lifnei Adonai. So the Torah explains in this part of the Torah, essentially Leviticus 10, 16, that by the priest, the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, eating, this particular korban in the Kodesh Kodeshim, that itself was a way to like lift up the one of the people, or to basically atone for the people. And it says specifically lechaper alahem lifnei Adonai. So essentially, this is another process that the Torah gives that is a type of atonement. It isn't just like the blood sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. So then we go back and we have to, basically say that what the New Testament is describing is a type of what's called avodah zarah. That this is, basically trying to insert, a person in this role and saying that they are replacing what the Torah says. That this person is between Hashem and you. You can't do it on your own. You need this person to be between you. And then this person is changing what the Torah says. Hashem says one thing. This particular group of authors of this text, because again, we don't know who really said what here. We just have some people who wrote this stuff in Greek and said, okay, well, this is what was happening, without any evidence that that's actually happened. And even if it did, we know that any statement made like this is against the Torah, and we know it's wrong. So in conclusion, what we understand and what we've seen is that the Torah is very clear, that there are different methodologies that Hashem gave for the Jewish people to deal with atonement. And the basic issue is that if a person turns away from their mistakes, from their transgressions of the Torah, that Hashem forgives for that. If a person turns away and says, okay, I'm not that person anymore, I don't want to be that anymore, I want to do something different, that is acceptable by Hashem. Now, again, why, as I mentioned before in the video, why was there this whole process given about the temple, about, bringing a korban, all this kind of stuff, the animals, why is that even there? And the basic understanding that a number of rabbis have, and I specifically take from the Rambam, for example, in his book of the Moreh Nevuchim, is because of the fact that Hashem understands human nature. And that there's an element of human nature that that is being drawn upon from the Torah, and that in the process of bringing the korban, there's a lesson that can be learned. For example, in going through this process of taking this animal, that the person either raised or that they purchase and bring it through this process, there's something that's supposed to awaken within the person, and the fact that they're going to the place of the central headquarters of the Torah, the temple, and being around people who keep the Torah correctly. This inspires them to be a different person, and that's the whole point of the process. So this is a Hav Ever from the Chronicles of a Hav Ever. I thank you for listening, and I hope this answers certain questions.